In the aftermath of the Holocaust, many survivors struggled with how to communicate their experiences of trauma and devastation. The catastrophic nature of the event meant that telling it, communicating it in words, sometimes seemed impossible. What words could in any way convey the depth of the horror and brutality that survivors lived through? At the same time, some survivors confronted the reluctance of family, friends, and wider society to listen to their stories. Many people wanted to get on with rebuilding their lives after the war and didn't want to be reminded of the terrible truths of the Nazi genocide, nor of the wider world's perceived complicity in it. This desire to return to a so-called normal life, however, was often interrupted by the ever-present and recurring trauma of the Holocaust. It defied normality, interrupting efforts to forget or move on. Rather, the trauma of the Holocaust was an interruption of that normal timeline, something that did not fit into a linear conception of chronology. For many who experienced this kind of trauma, the Holocaust did not simply end with the conclusion of the war. On the contrary, the event was ongoing and inescapable. Through flashbacks, sleep disorders, grief, emotional upheaval, or detachment, the past became present again for these survivors as they relived the trauma and continued to experience it. The possibility of maintaining a normal relationship with reality was shattered, leaving fragments and pieces that could not be reconciled with previous understandings of existence. Many of the medical and psychological findings that we have today about how humans react to trauma come from the experiences of Holocaust survivors, who had no language with which to integrate the horrors they endured with the reality of the world before the war. The experience of trauma is, of course, not unique to the Holocaust, and it is something that you will undoubtedly confront as physicians treating those who have lived through war, colonization, accidents, violence, illnesses, natural disasters, displacement, and many other catastrophes. But contemporary theories about trauma did stem from those who lived through the Holocaust. Their trauma often led to a kind of fractured identity, which is a common experience among survivors of different kinds of trauma. They felt irrevocably changed by the events of the Holocaust, and that there was no way to continue life as it was known before. Some believed that there was no way to express the horrors and the trauma of the Holocaust, and that silence was a better option than words that would somehow dishonor those who were killed or distort the facts. When understandings of humanism, morality, and religion broke down in the aftermath of the imprisonment and murder of millions of Jews and other persecuted people, so too did language. Holocaust survivor and writer Elie Wiesel raises this problem in the introduction to his well-known memoir, Night. He says, "How was one to rehabilitate and transform words betrayed and perverted by the enemy?" We know that many people were reticent to talk about their experiences during the Holocaust, whether because they were afraid of opening old wounds, traumatizing their children and families, or because the events that they witnessed or participated in were so terrible that it became almost impossible to speak about them. We also know that those who would be on the receiving end of these stories sometimes didn't want to hear them, or weren't able to hear them. It was often too much for people to comprehend, and this could lead to hostility or aggression. Survivors needed empathetic listeners, and didn't always find them in a post-war society that was focused on progressing beyond the tragedy. However, as time went on and survivors got older, this began to change. As they aged, many survivors of the Holocaust who had previously never spoken or written about their experiences now found a willing audience and a motivation to share their stories with the next generations of children and grandchildren. The 1980s and 1990s saw a huge boom in Holocaust testimony, education, and literature. And at the same time, there was a very strong push to record, document, share, and reflect on survivors' experiences, With the introduction of post-traumatic stress disorder and the recognition of trauma as its own phenomenon designated by the American Psychological Association in 1980, doctors and researchers began to formalize and categorize their thinking about trauma and the Holocaust. Although many survivors and scholars were already occupied with questions of disruption related to physical and psychological shock, trauma theory reached its fruition in the 1990s. Trauma began to be understood as a break in consciousness, rendering traumatized people unable to integrate it into their understandings of the world. Incorporating the work of psychologists, medical practitioners, therapists, historians, and literary scholars, trauma theory positions trauma in general and the Holocaust in particular as a rupture that does not fit into any pre-existing notions of reality. It interrupts the plot line of a person's life, defying normal scripts that would slot it in as just another experience to be processed and accepted. With trauma, such processing and acceptance was not always possible, and was certainly far from an easy task. Symptoms like flashbacks are commonly associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, and those who suffer from PTSD frequently cannot remember or think about the traumatic event without reliving it. As demonstrated by the testimony, memoirs, and writings of countless Holocaust survivors, the trauma does not end with the cessation of the traumatic event, but continues as a real, present, and active force in the mind of the traumatized person. Around the same time that trauma theory was becoming accepted in the mainstream, survivors started to write memoirs for their children or grandchildren in greater numbers. This is also around the time that the condition of children of Holocaust survivors became a point of interest and concern. Their parents would often pass on the wounds or attitudes that they had acquired during the war, whether intentionally or unintentionally. The concept of inherited or vicarious trauma can be applied here, as children of Holocaust survivors often felt great pressure, anxiety, and guilt about being alive when most of their family had not survived the war. In fact, the discourse around intergenerational trauma that today provides a helpful framework to people of many different backgrounds originated in the study of Holocaust survivors. Recent research in epigenetics actually demonstrates that genetic changes caused by the trauma of the Holocaust can be passed on from generation to generation, leading to an increased predisposition to anxiety, depression, and other stress disorders. At the same time, the desire of the second generation to witness the events and experiences of parents or other relatives motivated many people to delve into the study of the Holocaust in a wide range of fields and professions. Children of Holocaust survivors sought a way to connect with events and experiences that they themselves did not live through, but felt compelled to remember. Now we are at a point where not only the children, but the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Holocaust survivors are seeking out their family members' stories. We are also at a point where our understandings of trauma and PTSD are much more nuanced than they were in the immediate post-war period, during which many survivors encountered difficulties in sharing their stories because there was very little language by which to communicate their trauma. The task of comprehending and communicating trauma is still ongoing, as traumatized individuals and those seeking to help them contend with the ever-changing psychological, emotional, and medical impediments of trauma. However, there can be little doubt that the experiences of Holocaust survivors contributed significantly to the development of trauma theory and to our contemporary understandings of this important field.